Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Landon Zapsik. I'm a software architect here at ESC Spectrum. And I'm going to be going over our latest Prism DAS release, Prism 1.4, and the 8864 data controller, and more specifically, how those two kind of work together for your DAS. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email address is here. Or you can type them into the chat box, and we'll kind of go over those kind of at the end of this webinar. And then I'll also ask at the end if there's any questions as well. So feel free to ask those. Okay, I wanted to start by going over the 8864 data controller update, kind of giving you an update on the 8864 data controller hardware side of things. The most current version of the 8864 firmware is 6.0.1, I believe, and I think that was released, if not today, sometime this week maybe. So it's the latest release here in June 2021. And if you haven't upgraded to that, I would recommend doing that as soon as you can, or making a plan to go ahead and update the firmware on that. The minimum suggested firmware version for working with Prism is 6.00R42, which was released in August of 2020. The reason that is the minimum suggested version is because that version of the firmware does contain several Prism requested features that Prism does rely on. Specifically, Prism version 1.4 relies on several features in that firmware version or newer. Two of those are the clear all sequences command. So this was a command that was put into the 8864 specifically for Prism to clear the sequences code out, and then the sequences downloaded from Prism into the device, similar to how we work with other devices in the past. The additional command, which will be in Prism 1.5, is the sequence running status that's already been added to the 8864. That will allow us to get a very detailed status of what sequence is currently running, what step it's on, how much time is left in the sequence, things like that. So that will allow Prism 1.5 to have more detail on the current status of the running sequence. So again, make sure your firmware version is as up to date as you can be, particularly in these newer versions of Prism. So I'll give a little bit of background on Prism and the 8864 interaction between the two. Our initial Prism support for the 8864 was kind of designed to replicate the existing SpectraPack interaction for the most part. 8864 designed more of a SpectraPack replacement. That way we could rely on our code that we knew was functioning well and thoroughly tested. We kind of replicate how the 8864 collects data through the well-known paths we'd already built for the other devices as well. So 10-second samples, everything like that, kind of follow the same code path to minimize any kind of adverse side effects or anything like that. So we do currently support analog outputs on the 8864, which is something that obviously the SpectraPacks didn't support. So we have the ability to drive those depending on the card that goes into the 8864, and also the ability to support 8864 to Modbus sources, which you know, the SpectraPack kind of did that a little bit as well. The 8864 has a lot more capabilities and horsepower to do those Modbus sources. And looking to the future versions of Prism will expand on this 8864 integration. We're really just only scratching the surface on this device and what it's capable of. So we're pretty excited about some of the stuff we can do with the 8864 going forward. We haven't leveraged the calculations yet. There's more configuration options available. We can push the calibrations maybe to the 8864 qualifications, things like that. So there's a lot more it can do and we'll be working on in the future. So I wanted to kind of go over some of the 8864 setup steps that you might see when using your 8864 with Prism. ESC Spectrum will set up a new 8864 for you. We'll configure it depending on your hardware requirements, your hardware cards that go into the 8864. Get the points configured, the logger ID, IP address, all that will be set up initially. But these are some things I wanted to kind of go over that you may need to check on in the 8864, maybe after a firmware upgrade or an 8864 swap out or things like that. I'll just kind of show you how to walk through those. The 8864 has the capability to plug in a keyboard and access this menu I'm going to show you here through the keyboard directly on the terminal screen of the 8864 itself. And you can also access it through an SSH connection using a tool like PuTTY. You just put in the IP address and log in remotely. You'll get the same menu system that way that I'll be showing you here. So first one I wanted to show you is to enable the 8864 Modbus tables. So to do that, you go to C for configuration, S for the system parameters, and then M for configure Modbus. And that will essentially turn on the 8864 Modbus tables, which are the additional tables that SpectraView Prism does need to have turned on in order for all of our points that we're using to be captured and addressed correctly. So you just set that to yes, and then with a lot of these, there's a finished button down at the very bottom. Just go down that, click enter on it, and then hit yes, and that will save your configuration to the device. The next one is the analog output channel holding. So the 8864 does have the ability to drive analog outputs with an analog output card. And when those are configured, the way Prism acts is we obviously drive and set the analog outputs, but then we always read back the analog output values. We don't necessarily trust that we've set it to 20 milliamps. We want to actually read back the value that that analog output tells us it has. And the 8864 data controller has the ability to flash the value that it's reading to 0 in order to indicate a bad quality update, or it has the ability to hold the data between updates, which is what we want. So we'll be able to reliably read back the held value for that analog output channel back into Prism. So if you're looking at your analog outputs and see those go to 0 every now and then, that would be, you would need to change this on the channel, the whole data between updates. So go to change old configuration. Here are all of our data channels, analog inputs first. We'll scroll all the way to the side, and you can see our analog outputs here. We click on something like Knox High. There is an option here, hold data between updates, set that to yes, then go down to finish, configure now, and that will independently configure that particular channel to hold data between the updates. Prism does have Modbus update communication, stale data communication alarms built into it, so you shouldn't need the 8864 device stale data functionality because Prism has that built in. So channel naming, so the similar menu screen you just saw, you can configure the different names of these channels, and these will show up on the 8864 front panel. It can kind of help you as you're looking at some of these. We try to name them for you, typically with the AIN, the actual number, and then we'll typically put the tag name at the end of that. But you can change things here, like your storage interval, scaling, channel name, all that is configurable. Currently, Prism does not write to these from Prism itself. This is done by the software support group as part of an initial setup. So if you change any of these, you are changing it going forward as a permanent change. So obviously be careful getting in there and then changing some of the points that are already set up. Last one I wanted to go over with you is the calibrations or the sequences. So to get to those, it's just configuration, and then the calibration menu, configure calibrations, and then you configure an existing old cal program. So 8864 calls them calibrations. It's the same as sequences in Prism, the exact same thing. So you can see in there we had a list of calibrations, and we selected the auto cal. You can change things like the interval start date. There's also the ability to start a cal program right from here, which was a long requested feature of a lot of our customers that the SpectraPack didn't have, is some way to fire off calibrations from the SpectraPack itself. So the 8864 does have that. You just go CC and then find your calibration program and hit start. And then that will run, for example, your auto cal directly from the 8864. You can also stop it from the 8864 as well. So some handy stuff there. You can change things on the calibration, like the name, the timing, things like that. Just keep in mind that Prism is the master point of record for the sequences. So anything you change in the 8864 will be wiped out by Prism on the next download. So you want to make sure, if you want to make a permanent change, to change that just the way you always have within Prism on that sequences edit screen. And then Prism will take care of downloading and pushing that down to the 8864. So keep that in mind. Some miscellaneous notes about the 8864. Those must be configured prior to install based on the I/O cards, the Modbus communications, different parameter names, analog outputs, things like that. With Spectrum, the configuration team will do that for you as part of the purchase. And then you'll need to basically just save off 2 files. The configuration team will make backups of those. But there's a server.cfg file that needs to be saved, and then the channel config commands that will save as part of your configuration as well. So if you ever need to replace your 8864, it's really just a matter of setting up these 2 files and changing a few options on the 8864, and you should be back up and running. The options that I showed you on these previous slides can be changed anytime. You're welcome to log into your device and make those changes yourselves. Obviously, with the typical caveats of changing the configuration can have some side effects. So make sure that's properly secured and locked down and what you're doing. The firmware on the 8864 should be kept up to date. New security patches are always coming out, new features being added to the firmware. Very active development team adding a lot of cool stuff to the 8864. I believe they have at least 2 releases a year. They're always coming out with internal releases to our team, so we keep up to date with that as well. So we do have the ability to have maintenance plans available for your 8864s if that's something you're interested in. Talk to us about that. Includes firmware updates and things like that. 8864 obviously has a lot more capabilities than some of our previous devices, and again, that's an area of focus for us going forward, is how to leverage some of those and essentially make Prism and the 8864 even more capable going forward. So that pretty much is a little bit of a touch on the 8864. I wanted to go over Prism and some of the updates that have been happening to that. Our previous version, well, I guess as of today, it's the previous version, is 1.3.50.22.0, which was released in November of 2020. That was the first version to move to our internal UI framework, so it was a big change on the application customer side of things, not so much on the server side or the service side, but we did change out some of that internal framework in the customer-facing application. It was also the first version with full 8864 support as well. The current version, which we're releasing this week, is 1.4.0.0. And some of the new features here, we're working towards adding more system visibility. That's an area of focus for us and our development team going forward, is how do we show you more of what the system's doing, how it's configured, give you more visibility into your system so you can see a little bit more of what's going on. So we've started that effort, and we're adding some new configuration screens that will allow you to see some of that, and we're going to continue with that going forward. And we've added some tag detail pop-up in the main application that will give you more visibility into individual points in the system, how they're configured, what they're looking at, what they're dependent on, things like that. Cybersecurity is also a major focus for us, so we did implement a one-way UDP data push. This allows us to push data across a one-way boundary to satisfy some cybersecurity requirements. So if that's something you're interested in, we do have some available options there as well. We added some specialized part 60 methods, another customer request specific to different permit interpretations. And then we did fix some smaller user interface bugs that had to do with that UI change out as well. The new configuration view, so I want to briefly show you this screen. That's something that's in Prism 1.4. that you'll be able to see, provided you have the necessary permissions to see it. Right now, it's designed as a read-only screen view. We do have, obviously, like I said before, plans to update that to maybe allow some configuration, some data editing, configuration editing in the future. The good news is all of that is stored in our database and it's accessible. We're just going to need the feature build out to enable users to interact with that. So here's an example of the training system. That's why it's all red. We've got a lot of alarms here, but you basically go to the administration section, and then there's a new button here for site configuration, which you can click on. And that basically has 4 different tabs here. You can see the different instruments in your system, the reporting methods, span, things like that, what those are configured for. And then you can see your qualification reports. For example, we have our hourly Part 75 report, and you can see all the points that go into that report, your NOx rate, things like that. These are dictated by the EPA that are reportable numbers, and you can see what goes into each one of these points, the formulas, parameters, things like that as well. There's a tab for monitoring systems. You can see those and the different objects that make up a system. And then there's also a tab for compliance, which shows your exceedances and what those are configured for, what those are driven off of, and your exceedance limits. So again, just to kind of give you some visibility into how that's configured. The tag detail view was partially implemented in the last release. So this is mainly on the main screen when you're looking at the different tags or points in the system. If you hover over them, either digitals or analogs, this pop-up will pop up and give you some detailed information into how that point is configured. So it's designed as kind of a drill down. We don't show, obviously, all this information from the get-go, but if there is a point you're interested in, you're able to drill down and kind of see more configuration information about that point. So you can see the unit that it belongs to. If it's an IO point, you can see under the IO section which data logger it's on, the point address, different things like that as well. Here we're looking at our NOx rate, which is a calculation tag. We're not storing it to the database. It's not recordable. You can see the actual formula that goes into that, the different constants, and then any tags that are dependent on this tag. So our NOx pounds calculation is dependent on this NOx rate calculation. So again, just designed to give you a little more visibility into the points and what's going on in your system. I'll touch a little bit on the one-way UDP communication. So this may be a little more technical than some of you are after, but I'll just kind of briefly go over it. Most of the network traffic that we use day to day is using what's called TCP/IP, which is the basic network layer Ethernet uses. That's designed as a two-way kind of communication for acknowledge and receive, send and receive and acknowledge to make sure that network packets get to their destination and that kind of good stuff. UDP is a different network communication layer entirely. It's designed mainly for broadcast, and it can be used in a broadcast way in which there's no response or no acknowledgement needed. So that means we can use it to push data in a one-way direction without requiring a response from the other end. So you can use it to push data across some sort of one-way network firewall or boundary, and you don't have to worry about data reaching in the other way. So that may be something that you may want to think about if that's a requirement you have from IT or cybersecurity coming up in the future. So basically, we've designed the tag service to implement UDP data push. So from one instance of the tag service to the other, it will push real-time data via UDP across a one-way boundary. And we've also written a new data broadcaster service, which pushes some data via UDP across a one-way boundary as well, from the internal server to the external server. None of this is enabled by default, but it's all in Prism 1.4. It's designed to work with an internal Prism server using that UDP data push across a one-way firewall to an external Prism server of record on the outside that captures that and essentially functions as normal on the outside. So something to consider if that's a requirement you may have coming up. I wanted to go over a permissions data log entry. So if you're in the admin screen and you're editing, users and security, and you change something like the roles or change anything in here, and hit save, you now have the option to put in a day log message, describing what you changed here. This is just a small change we added at a customer request to let people know what's going on via a day log entry. Some more miscellaneous new features. I mentioned some of these earlier, some of the Part 60 calibration qualifications we implemented. Online calibration must be performed every 26 clock hours, and an 8-hour online grace period applies to Part 60 instruments. This is not enabled by default. These are new instrument types, so this wouldn't affect any existing setups, but this is something that we can add. For example, if you have different permit requirements or permit interpretations, we can definitely address those through updates like these. We did add an option to bypass the startup cache of the application. So when you launch the application, if you hold down the control key, you can force a repull of everything from the database if needed. That was more of a request from our support team than anything, but that's there as well. And then we removed code that stops any currently running sequences when a sequence start is called. This really only affects services. So the services do call sequence start. For example, when an AutoCal is called to start up after a unit comes online, if you have that option enabled, our services will make the call to the data collector service to start that service up. So that's now allowed to go through. The 8864 has the capability to run multiple sequences at the same time. So we've removed that artificial limitation from our code, and the 8864 generally will be able to run those at the same time. Some miscellaneous bug fixes for Prism 1.4. A lot of these were related to the internal framework UI change, and most of these were on the very small side on the user interface application side. So things like refreshing, things not selected correctly. Some of those were a lot smaller issues that we found and were able to fix in some of the 50/20 versions as well as 1.4. So 1.4 does address some of those smaller ones, things like refreshing, unmuting an alarm, things like that that you may not run into have been fixed as well. 8864 sometimes stuck restoring data from a power outage. This I don't think has actually happened anywhere, but we do have do have something that addresses that. If an 8864 is powered off for a long period of time, the service sometimes didn't restore correctly. There was no data loss, but it's just the service was stuck on restoring, and software would have to go in and restart that. But that's been addressed. Part 65 days of warning now issues the correct out of control at the correct time. I think that was just a tweak to when that was out of control. We did have a situation where the new recalc framework could sometimes skip samples depending on different conditions. I think it was a combination of 2 or 3 things had to be set in certain ways in order for that bug to pop up. But we did fix that. I don't know that anybody actually ran into that either. The dashboard button styles were removed in 5022. So if you upgraded to 5022 and your dashboard buttons are a different color or not working correctly, we have addressed that in Prism version 1.4 as well. Something that you probably would have seen is the client application time is not the real SIM server time. That was from the UI framework update. We changed that back to look at the actual server time like it should be. So now that time in your client application, you can be assured is the real SIM server time again. And the time of the last backup was not always correct. We fixed that as well. So if you have where it shows the last backup up there on your client application in those flyouts, that's been fixed as well. So moving on to Prism 1.5 planned updates, some things that we have planned for the next release of Prism. So 1.4 is a spring release, 1.5 will be our fall release for the end of this year. One of the major things we're working on, it's quite a large effort, is the calibration in progress changes with the new capabilities added to the 8864 that allow us to drill down on exactly what sequence is running, where that sequence is in its steps, how much time is left. We're going to take that feature and pull it all the way through the calibration now running page and just design that page better to give you a better view of exactly where you are in the sequence, fix the timeline, redesign some of those elements there to just kind of work better with how a calibration should look when it's running through its cals. We're also planning some recalculation updates. We have the ability to calculate the time remaining on a recalc, which has been a user requested feature as well. Hopefully we'll be able to add that to the client application so you can see exactly how long this recalc may take based on how it's been going so far. And we also want to add the ability to update multiple constants at once and then trigger off a recalc after your constants have been edited. So kind of edit in kind of a batch mode, and then once you're done, kind of hit some sort of save, and then Prism will go off and mark everything as recalc once, and then do it that way if you're editing multiple things at one time. We also want to add the ability to override any kind of qualified values. So if you lose things like fuel flow, something like that in the past, software support has had to go in and manually add those numbers from you from a spreadsheet or something like that. We want to at least have the back end working where we can override those values. So we'll enter an override number maybe in a separate table and then have Prism recalculate based on that. And then a UI front end for those overrides will be coming probably in a later version to allow you to go in and then make those overrides yourself. And again, another area of focus for us in 1.5 and going forward is going to be adding additional administration features and redesign of those screens and additional visibility and functionality to allow you to better look into your system and better make changes and edits and configuration changes in Prism as well. So that's something we're going to be looking at as well. Another planned update for 1.5 that didn't quite make it into 1.4 is the server installer. So we have most of that done. I don't know that that's going to be a huge thing for a lot of you all to use. That may be something that's typically done by our support group, but hopefully we'll have a server installer that will install all the services, connect to the database, update the services, things like that through this installer, which is all currently done manually. So it's a little more cumbersome, but a server installer would be nice, and this is a screenshot of what it may look like. Another cool feature that is going to be in 1.5 that's already feature complete, just needs to be tested, is audit log viewing. So with a lot of the objects in the Prism code base, anytime any change is made to them, we write to what's called an audit log that captures the user that made the change, the time the change was made, and the actual changes that were made to that object. So for example, if you edit a bottle, we will capture who made that change to that bottle, what the actual change was, and store that in the database forever. So that can be retrieved based off of that particular bottle. And now we have the ability to actually view that in Prism. So basically here you would just click on this little icon with the notepad and the clock. Anytime you see that icon in Prism going forward in 1.5 or later, that will be the ability to hover over that and view changes for that particular object. In this case, this is a bottle, and it's showing changes from newest to oldest on what we've changed in that bottle, which there are a lot here because we were testing the changes on this particular bottle, so that's why you see so many. Also for RataView, we're adding a new digital display to the test that's now running. So in 1.5, this will be added to tests now running, a little section down here, which will show you which digital outputs are currently active and which ones are inactive. That way you can see what's going on as far as which ones are being exercised, and you can toggle those if needed as well. That's pretty much it for the main stuff for 1.5 that's planned, which will be our fall release. I did want to mention we do have a summer training event here in Pensacola, August 17th through 20th. I believe there's still a few registration spots open. So if that's something you're interested in attending, you should have gotten an email on it. But if not, see one of us and we'll point you in the right direction. But you just register for that. And again, it's here in Pensacola on the first day The 17th, which is a Tuesday, will be the Prism and the 8864 class, which I know you'll want to attend. And then after that, you can probably just take the rest of the week off and sit at the beach if you wanted to. But no, there's going to be a bunch of different classes and some vendor showcases as well. So it'll be good to kind of see everybody again if that's something you're able to make it to. It's myself and Anthony, I believe, doing the majority of the Prism and 8864 training. So Anthony's kind of the program manager, the resident expert on the 8864. So between the two of us, we'll be able to answer any kind of Prism and 8864 questions you may have. So hopefully it'll be something that you guys get some value out of. So, all right. Well, if not, I appreciate everyone attending, and hopefully we'll look forward to seeing you maybe the training event this August. And again, if you have anything, please feel free to let me know. Thanks, everyone.